Hello there, welcome to Random Review. This is my first ever attempt at making a review, so let's see how it goes. First off the bat, as a kind of introduction as to why I'm starting a review channel, I thought mainly just as a random kind of choice, I would just start essentially with what I currently have in my collection. My collection's mainly just CDs. I think at an estimate, it's probably around 200 to 300 if I had to count them all. Mainly centered around progressive rock, psychedelic rock, classic rock. A lot of your typical kind of 60s, 70s bands. I've got a few other different genres in there. My tastes aren't exclusive just to those kinds of things, but they are, ultimately my kind of first love, as it were. Um, Again, another reason why I wanted to start a kind of random review, aside from just a way of killing a little bit of time on my days off as well, is essentially I wanted to kind of pick up on a few things that from watching other review channels. I just wanted to try something a little bit different to begin with things that I haven't really seen being reviewed. So first off the bat, I'm not going to focus on progressive rock or classic rock. We're going to go straight into psychedelic instrumental territory. My first choice for a review is going to be none other than Ozric Tentacles with Pungent Effulgent from 1989, I believe, if the information is correct on that. Um, it's a bit of a difficult one to start off with because they're an instrumental band. They don't have a lyricist, they don't have a vocalist. You might find throughout their discography that you might get some ever so little kind of slight snippets of possibly vocal samples or someone just kind of like garbling in the background. But vocals aren't really a necessity with this band or with their kind of style of music. Um, my first introduction to them as a band, luckily enough, was actually seeing them live. So I did have that kind of added impact of experiencing what they were capable of doing in a live setting before I actually heard anything in terms of studio albums. So I think it's safe to say it's probably one of the reasons why I started with this particular band as well. I was quite young when I saw them. I think I was around 12 or 13, if I had to hazard a guess. I think it was back in 2004, actually, when I saw them at a festival. On the advice of one of my parents, they basically kind of said, you're going to want to stick around and see this group. And they were right. I've stayed with them ever since. And I think initially when I started to get into them, I think the first actual CD that I picked up of them was a double release. I think it was a remix album, followed by a kind of like a little bit of a kind of mishmash of an album where it's a little bit of live material, a little bit of studio material. So I didn't necessarily start off with them in terms of one of their official kind of studio albums. However, I think what really cemented their kind of typical early and mid-period sound was kind of solidified with this album, Pungent Effulgent. Little bit of background history about the band from what I know of. This may not be correct, but I think they started in the very early 80s working on the festival circuit. This particular album, Pungent Effulgent, I think it's considered like their kind of first professional release, and I think I've seen some places online where people have kind of considered this their debut, although that's not entirely true. I think they did release maybe 4 or 5 albums and a couple of live albums previous to this one, but they were mainly circulated in the tape trading scene. Obviously, in the 80s, you only had tapes, CDs, or vinyl. Obviously, tapes were a much cheaper and affordable format where you could kind of record in bulk and produce them yourself. At least that's my understanding of it. I was born in 1987, so obviously I was kind of aware of these things growing up, but by the time obviously I'd grown up, the world had changed, like tapes were on their way out and whatnot. Um, so stylistically, as a band, I mean, they do hail from that kind of typical kind of psychedelic lineage. I mean, obviously the biggest band that springs to mind, not necessarily sound wise, but I think in terms of ethos and that whole kind of scene is it can be none other than Hawkwind. Obviously, they were the kind of granddaddies of this kind of ideology behind how a band operates and the kind of people that they play to, the festivals that they appear at, and whatnot. Um, Obviously, as stated previously, they are a instrumental outfit as well. So there's quite a few key tracks on this particular album that, for me, really kind of cements what the Ozrics are about. Again, they are a bit of a difficult band to kind of explain and to kind of describe. I'd say largely out of their extensive back catalogue as well. You could almost say that they're guilty of being a bit samey, but I would argue the other side of that coin by saying, well, that may be the case. However, there's no one else that sounds like them. That is the whole point of the Ozric Tentacles. That is them. That is their sound, and that is what they created. There's no one that sounds like them. You could potentially find a couple of bands where you can say that there's a very strong influence, but at the same time, they bring some of their own things to this table. And as such, you can definitely differentiate between these bands. So it starts off with what I would consider one of their quintessential and most essential songs as well. It starts off with Dissolution, The Clouds Disperse. Again, every single time that I hear the opening delayed guitar strings on this particular song, it still sends shivers down my spine. I'm not entirely sure what the word is for that, but that sensation where you hear a particular song or a particular part of a song and it makes your hairs stand up, you get goosebumps, you shiver, you shake. It's for me, it's very much one of those songs. Again, has a very interesting and intricate build up, some very, very warm bass that gets introduced to it. Obviously builds up to a very unique crescendo where suddenly you have all of these really like amazing synth work as well that then leads into this absolutely screeching and scorching crashing solo that essentially is just the opening punch and the opening statement for not only the album but for me personally is what the Ozric Tentacles are all about. Again, with Edwin being the main focal person of the band as well, his soloing and his guitar style is very unique. It can be made comparable to a lot of other guitar virtuosos, but at the same time, he doesn't sound like people like Steve Vai or Joe Satriani. He very much has his own kind of sound. Um, Again, it just the entire song just opens up the entire album with just a really unique atmosphere of what's to come. And again, as an album, it's not to say that the entire album is always just like that. There's a lot of introductions to a lot more kind of slower passages within songs as well. They start to kind of slip in a lot of world music influences as well. There's a lot of interesting uses of different scales from all around the world. The follow-up song, 0 to 1 or 0-1, it introduces some very interesting scales that are quite reminiscent of either Middle Eastern or Asian as well. It's just very, very interesting. Very whimsical, very what I would call that typical kind of hippie drippy sound, if you will. And I absolutely love it. I'm sure there's going to be some people that are going to be detractors from that, but not for me, I'm afraid. I'm definitely a fan for life. Again, the entire album ebbs and flows with tracks that do kind of pick up the pace a little bit, and then others that are a lot more kind of subdued, and it just evokes that whole kind of idea of world building, and I think that is aided by the fact that they are an instrumental group. I mean, a lot of other bands will rely on a lyrical narrative. Obviously, you have the added element that if there is a vocalist, the style of or the ability that they have within their range obviously lends to the overall atmosphere of a kind of standard, typical kind of band. But that's not really evident here. I think that it's definitely the right approach for this kind of music, where essentially they are letting the music speak for itself. I mean, being so comfortable with this kind of style that the band makes, I couldn't really imagine what they would sound like if they introduced a vocalist. It'd be interesting, but this far down the line, I can't see that really happening, and it would be strange. But also, what would they sing about? I mean, they had this unique ability to build an entire world with just their music that I think lyrics and vocals would kind of render that almost useless. Really, I think that is what makes them unique. I mean, going through the album, again, as it starts to kind of taper off as well, another two really big standout tracks for myself is Ayurvedic, which kind of delves into a very, very nice, almost kind of jazzy, very quiet kind of build up with added flutes as well. Has a very Indian vibe to it as well, and again also introduces Edwin's virtuoso guitar stylings as well. Interestingly enough as well, another genre that they do dabble in and that they do tend to kind of drop in there periodically throughout their albums as well, is that the track, again, once it all kind of starts winding down after it becomes so incredibly chaotic, just completely left of field, they just taper the song off with basically a kind of a dub reggae track as well, drenched in reverb as well. Very different from your kind of typical kind of traditional dub stylings that you would have had from like late 60s, early 70s. They make it their own, even though it is distinctly a very dubby end to the song. Again, picking things up again with another slap to the face is Kick Muck that follows on from Ayurvedic. Again, I think Kick Muck is probably, I would hazard a guess that it's very much a fan favourite. It's also one of their shorter kind of songs, I would say, so that gives it some added weight and a little bit more extra punch. And it's just that main riff, it's just so incredibly catchy. It's just an earworm. It just sticks with you, and yeah, I think that's what makes it a standout track and a fan favourite. An interesting note on that particular riff, without being a rip-off at all, it's quite reminiscent of the Steve Hillage Om riff, I think, that he uses in some of his solo work, but definitely reminiscent of the main riff that you find in Master Builder by Gong on their You album. So again, it very much kind of shows that it has that lineage from the days of bands like Hawkwind and Gong. So I think they definitely have kind of taken a lot of influence from them, but without necessarily copying them. As I stated previously, there's no one that sounds quite like them. Another interesting aspect as well, just speaking about the Ozrics, is how important they were in kind of really tapping into an area of music that would become very influential, although not rock-based at all, within electronic music. Obviously, around the kind of early mid-90s, the Goa trance scene was starting to pick up quite a lot of pace, and although it's predominantly electronically based and again very much trance-based, so obviously you it's undeniable whether you have a trance track in front of you purely because of the synthetic, just constant 4/4 kick drum beat and whatnot. But a lot of the kind of electronic sequences that the Ozrics use, and again other bands like Tangerine Dream and whatnot, fundamental in forming the main components within Goa trance that then evolved into psychedelic trance. And you can really hear how certain elements of the Ozric Tentacles music has kind of permeated into that, no less when psytrance started to kind of evolve out of just that completely relentless 4/4 beats, kind of spreading out into kind of more ambient territory, and then what would eventually become the Sybient genre with outfits like Spongle. I think it goes without saying that Simon Posford must have listened to Ozric Tentacles within his time. I don't know that as a fact, but I'm pretty certain if I had to put my money where my mouth is, I'd probably say that Simon Posford is probably undeniably an Ozric Tentacles fan, or at least he must have been at some point in his life. Another interesting little fact as well, the drummer at the time of Ozric Tentacles within this particular period, a chap called Merv Pepler, he eventually left Ozric Tentacles to pursue just purely electronic based music. So he still currently has his own outfit, a group known as Eat Static. They started off as a duo with the synth player from Ozric Tentacles as well. Again, Eat Static were quite fundamental in being quite a big influence in what would eventually become psytrance and Sybient music. So I think for future, I probably will maybe delve into some Eat Static or some Spongle. It seems like as a first review, I've started off on this particular tangent and something that's a little bit different. So I think I probably will periodically start off with my psychedelic electronic music collection. Again, I think that will be the most difficult genre for me to cover because, again, most of this music doesn't rely on vocals. There's a lot of heavy use of sample dialogue from things like films or lectures or, you know, philosophy quotes and whatnot, or things that delve into kind of Eastern mysticism. But that's not necessarily anything that kind of demands anything like vocals. So it'll be quite interesting to see what I do in future with any other album reviews. But yeah, I'm going to leave it at that for now. And yeah, if anyone does have the time to comment, please do. Whether or not I do get back to commenting remains to be seen. I have quite a busy schedule. But like I said, I'm just killing half an hour every single time that I have a day off to just try and have a little bit of fun and cover some albums that are in my collection. So yeah, thanks for listening, and yeah, I'll see you next time.